The conversation around Diamond DeShields, Caitlin Clark, and the WNBA has taken on a life of its own. And the reason it keeps growing is because it no longer looks like people are talking about one isolated play. A lot of fans now see a bigger pattern. They look at the hit on Clark. Then they look at what happened afterward with DeShields, with Kennedy Carter, and even with Sheryl Swoopes in the media world. And they believe all of it points to the same conclusion. In their view, the league has reached a moment where anything seen as targeting Caitlin Clark is going to bring a level of backlash and consequence that simply did not exist before. Whether everyone agrees with that interpretation or not, that is the debate dominating the conversation. The play that fueled all of this came in the Indiana Fever and Chicago Sky matchup, when Clark was moving into the lane in transition, and Diamond DeShields made hard contact with her. To a lot of viewers, it did not look like a normal basketball collision. It looked deliberate. Clark went down hard, the whistle blew, and the officials treated it like an ordinary foul in the moment. That decision immediately became part of the story, because fans watching the replay believed the contact deserved far more serious treatment. The reaction online was instant. People were not debating whether it was physical. They were debating how something that looked so forceful and so obvious could be handled so lightly in real time. What made the clip spread even faster was the way it looked on replay. Fans zeroed in on the body language, the angle of the hit, and the fact that Clark appeared to be the focus rather than the ball. That is why so many people described it as a cheap shot instead of just hard defense. In a league where physical play is part of the identity, there is still a line, and for many viewers, DeShields crossed it. The controversy became even more intense because of the way Clark responded. She got up, moved on, and did not turn the moment into a spectacle. That only made more people rally around her, because it reinforced the image that she was being forced to absorb contact, while others were creating the drama around her. From there, the bigger narrative took over. The hit itself was one thing, but what happened later became the real fuel for the online debate. DeShields continued her season, but her role started shrinking. Then came roster changes. Then came more movement. Then came the appearance that her standing in the league had changed dramatically. At that point, a lot of fans were no longer just looking at the original clip. They were connecting her career instability to that moment and arguing that the WNBA, whether officially or unofficially, had decided it was no longer going to tolerate that kind of attention around its biggest star. That is where the discussion becomes more complicated, because the league did not come out and announce some sweeping punishment tied directly to that play. There was no dramatic league-wide statement saying Diamond DeShields was being removed because of Caitlin Clark. But in the minds of many fans, the sequence of events told its own story. They saw a player involved in one of the most criticized on-court moments involving Clark, and then they watched that player move from team to team without ever finding stable footing again. To them, that looked less like coincidence and more like a message. The reason people are so quick to make that connection is because DeShields was not viewed as just any fringe player. She had experience, a resume, and enough history in the league that bouncing around so quickly raised eyebrows. When a player with that background cannot stick, fans naturally start asking why. And once those questions start, the most viral and controversial moment attached to that player becomes the first thing everyone brings up. That is exactly what happened here. For many people watching from the outside, the hit on Clark became the defining image of DeShields' recent WNBA identity, whether fair or unfair. The same logic is why Kennedy Carter's name keeps coming up in the same conversation. Carter's infamous foul on Clark earlier became one of the biggest WNBA talking points of the season. It was upgraded after review, and the aftermath only got louder when Carter refused to engage with questions about Clark afterward. That moment stuck with fans because it felt like another example of hostility toward the player drawing the most eyes to the league. Once that happened, every later development in Carter's career started getting filtered through that lens. So when people discuss DeShields now, they do not treat it like a separate case. They place it in a chain of events that they believe shows the league tightening up around Clark. Then there is Sheryl Swoopes, whose situation is obviously different because it played out in broadcasting rather than on the court. But even there, people believe the same pattern showed up. Swoopes had been respected for her knowledge and stature in the game, yet the more criticism she received over comment about Clark, the more her public standing seemed to shift. Once high-profile pushback started coming from other media voices, and fans began accusing her of obvious bias. The scrutiny intensified, so when she later lost visible broadcasting ground, many people immediately connected that to the Clark conversation too. Again, maybe not everyone agrees with that cause and effect view, but it is absolutely how a large part of the audience sees it. That is why this topic is not really about Diamond DeShields alone anymore. It is about whether the WNBA has quietly made a business decision. And that is the core argument people keep returning to. Caitlin Clark changed the economics of the league in a way that is impossible to ignore. Ratings surged, attendance jumped, merchandise moved, social media exploded. National discussion around the WNBA became much louder and much more constant. Whether people love Clark, dislike the media obsession around her, or feel conflicted about the entire phenomenon, the numbers changed when she arrived. That part is what makes the rest of the debate so intense. A lot of fans believe the league looked at that reality and realized it could not afford to let its most important commercial engine become the target of cheap shots, personal agendas, or toxic public commentary. That does not necessarily mean every player who fouls Clark is going to be pushed out. But it does mean that once a player becomes publicly linked to the idea of targeting her, the tolerance for baggage may be dramatically lower than before. In that environment, the smallest controversy gets magnified. The player is no longer being judged only as a basketball asset. They are being judged as a potential public relations problem. That is why the business side of the WNBA keeps showing up in this debate. The league is not operating in some emotional vacuum. It is trying to grow. It is trying to secure bigger television deals, stronger sponsorships, and more long-term momentum. Clark's arrival gave the league a level of mainstream attention had been chasing for years. Once that happened, everything changed. A player who drives that kind of interest is not just another rookie or another star. She becomes central to the league's future. Fans understand that, teams understand that, and front offices absolutely understand that. So when people say the WNBA is protecting Caitlin Clark, what they often really mean is that the league is protecting the business impact she represents. That does not mean every criticism of Clark is automatically illegitimate, and it does not mean every adverse roster move somewhere around the league is part of conspiracy. But the perception is powerful. And in modern sports, perception matters almost as much as official action. If players, coaches, executives, and media personalities believe certain kinds of anti-Clark behavior are now bad for business, then the practical result can look very similar to direct league discipline, even when it is not formally announced that way. That is why people keep describing the response as quiet but clear. The fever's rise only strengthens that feeling. Clark did not enter a perfectly polished contender. She entered a team that had struggled badly, and then quickly became the center of one of the biggest transformations in the league. With players like Aaliyah Boston and Kelsey Mitchell around her, Indiana began looking like a team that mattered nationally. The arenas were fuller. The road crowds were bigger. The coverage got louder. Clark's style, her passing, her range, and her overall star power made the fever appointment viewing. Once that happened, the league's priorities inevitably shifted around the environment she helped create. That shift is exactly why some fans believe the old culture of shrugging off dirty or borderline behavior no longer fits what the league needs. In their view, the WNBA used to tolerate too much negativity around its biggest opportunities. Now it cannot afford to. If the goal is long-term growth, better salaries, stronger visibility, and a better commercial future for everybody, then protecting the most obvious driver of that momentum becomes a logical move. That is the argument many commentators keep making, and it explains why the Clark conversation feels so different from typical player drama. What also helps Clark in the eyes of the public is her demeanor. She does not usually escalate these moments. She does not spend her time publicly attacking teammates or opponents. She often redirects praise, talks basketball, and moves on. That creates a striking contrast when others appear more emotional, more bitter, or more reactive around her. In a league already wrestling with how to handle new attention, that contrast matters. Fans tend to side with a player who looks like she is simply trying to compete, while others look consumed by frustration. That public sympathy then feeds directly into the way every incident is interpreted. A hard foul on Clark is not seen as just a hard foul. It is seen as an attack on the player carrying the league forward. Criticism of Clark is not seen as ordinary debate. It is seen as resentment toward the one star bringing new fans into the sport. Once that emotional frame takes hold, the people who put themselves on the wrong side of it face a much harsher environment than they otherwise would. That is the world Diamond DeShields ended up in after that moment against Indiana. And that is why people keep saying the WNBA has entered a new era. In the old version of the league, fans might have argued over a dirty play for a few days and moved on. In this version, the reaction can become career-defining because the player involved is Caitlin Clark. That may not feel fair to everyone, but it is the reality of what happens when one athlete becomes as important to a league's visibility, growth, and negotiating power. Everything around her becomes more intense. Every foul gets replayed more. Every quote gets dissected more. Every roster move gets interpreted through a bigger lens. In the end, that is what this DeShields conversation is really about. It is about whether the WNBA has decided that the cost of appearing soft on anti-Clark behavior is simply too high. A lot of fans think the answer is yes. They look at DeShields, Carter, and Swoops and believe the pattern is obvious. They see a league drawing a line, not always with public punishment, but with quiet distance and unmistakable signals. Others may say the league is not protecting Clark so much as adjusting to a new business reality that she created. Either way, the message many people have taken from all of this is the same. If you become identified as someone targeting the player driving the league's biggest growth surge, the margin for error around your future gets very, very small. And that may be the clearest sign of how much Caitlin Clark has changed the WNBA. The issue is no longer just whether opponents play her physically. The issue is whether the league, the teams, the media, and the fans now see that physicality and hostility as a threat to the league's future. Once the conversation reached that point, someone like Diamond DeShields was always going to become more than just one player involved in one controversial play. She became part of a much larger argument about power, growth, accountability, and the direction the WNBA has chosen to go.